Welcome to her Fireside Stories, where captivating tales come alive. Imagine your own child calling you just a burden right at the Thanksgiving table, not knowing you hold a fortune capable of changing everything. How would you react if your family discovered you've been quietly sitting on millions? Stay with us until the very end to see how Robert's face falls dramatically when he uncovers his mother's incredible secret fortune. And trust me, the outcome will leave you speechless. If you love stories that tug at your heartstrings, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to support us and stay updated with more intriguing stories. I'd love to hear your thoughts on today's story, so comment below and let us know where you're tuning in from. I never thought I'd hear my own child speak to me that way, especially not on Thanksgiving. But there he stood, my firstborn, leveling the accusation as if flinging food off his plate. "You're just a burden, Mom." In that moment, the warmth of the turkey, the softness of the mashed potatoes, and the spice of the pumpkin pie all seemed to evaporate, leaving a cold hush in the dining room. His words struck like shards of ice against my heart. My fork slipped from my fingers and clattered on the porcelain plate. The candles flickered, throwing uncertain shadows across faces that were equally stunned and conflicted. I remember thinking, did he really just call me a burden? From where I sat at one end of the table, I could see my grandchildren's eyes darting toward me, confusion written in their expressions. My daughter-in-law looked frozen, uncertain whether to speak or look away. My daughter, who had flown in from out of state, pressed her lips together in shock, her gaze shifting between her brother and me. Even the gravy boat seemed to hover mid-air in my son-in-law's grip, arrested by the tension. Yet in my purse, just within reach, lay documents, evidence of the one secret I'd kept for decades. A secret large enough to buy this house my son was so proud of, many times over. A secret large enough to alter every assumption he'd ever made about me. I glanced down at the half-eaten roll on my plate and thought, should I say it now? Should I reveal it all? But I felt only numbness, the numbness that comes when illusions are shattered. My son, the one I raised and sacrificed for, saw me as a burden, and no matter the size of my hidden fortune, that truth hurt more than any check could fix. Before we dive further into this expanded version of my story, let me ask those of you joining in. Comment 1 if you think you would have confronted him right on the spot, or 2 if you would have walked away to gather your thoughts. I'm genuinely curious how you might handle a shock like that. Sometimes it's a single phrase that changes everything, and in my case, it certainly did. It might help to understand how I got to that point, why I let my own son grow into a man who believed his mother was helpless, fragile, and ultimately a burden. My husband and I started out with nothing but hope in our pockets. We were just two young dreamers in a cramped studio apartment, the corners of the ceiling stained with old water leaks. We worked, saved, and, most importantly, innovated. In those early days, my late husband discovered a more efficient way to catalog shipyard inventory. I refined it into a tangible system we later patented. The patent, an unassuming piece of paper, became the soil from which our secret fortune quietly blossomed. We weren't always thrifty by necessity. Initially, we had no other choice. The bills piled up, and the only items we could afford in our fridge were generic labeled cans of soup and a jug of milk. But as time went on, our patent started earning small royalties, then larger ones. Eventually, we saw money accumulate in our account in ways we hadn't dared dream of when we were younger. If you've ever spent nights awake calculating how much you can spend on groceries without going under, you might understand how exhilarating, even terrifying, it can be to see numbers suddenly multiply. Why did we keep it a secret, even from our own children? At first, we told ourselves that we didn't want to spoil them. We'd seen families destroyed by too much money with too few boundaries. We valued hard work, compassion, and community more than status symbols. My husband, a quiet man with calloused hands from the docks, used to say, "Money only reveals who you really are. It won't fix your flaws, it'll just make them bigger." But secrets have a way of growing roots deep inside a family's structure, twisting around every conversation, every plan, every memory. When my husband passed suddenly from a heart attack, I felt too lost in grief to reveal the truth. The secret by then felt too big to unveil, and I was convinced my son and daughter needed to rely on their own drive, not the cushion of an inheritance. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. 1 for East Coast, 2 for West Coast, or 3 if you're somewhere else. I'm always curious how far our stories travel. For the longest time, my son, let's call him Garrett, truly believed I was getting by on a humble, meager existence. He saw me as a retired bookkeeper, part-time consultant, or maybe just an aging widowed teacher. He loved to lump me into my earliest profession whenever it suited the narrative of me being limited, who might soon need real help if money ran out or if my hips started giving me trouble. I let him have that notion, partly out of misplaced compassion. I didn't want to overshadow his ambition. I watched him climb the corporate ladder, boasting about deals and clients, spending extravagantly on the house in the hills he felt he deserved. The cracks in our relationship began to show a few years before that Thanksgiving dinner. Garrett would drop subtle, sharp comments when he thought I wasn't listening. "She still drives that old car? She can't even hire someone to fix her gutters? She insists on living in that drafty old house?" It stung. But each time, I'd smile softly and remind him, "I'm all right, Garrett. Trust me." I wondered sometimes if he was projecting his own stress onto me, if he worried about how my perceived lack of funds would eventually tap into his. Maybe he was nervous about potential medical bills or the cost of end-of-life care. People can feel real dread thinking about the day they might have to financially support their parents. And yet, ironically, that hidden sum in my bank account was so large that any financial crisis would have been a droplet in a much larger ocean. I had always entertained the idea of telling him. Countless times I imagined scenarios. Maybe at his 35th birthday, I'd say, "Surprise, you're set for life, if you just keep living responsibly." Or perhaps before my granddaughter's birth, I'd wave statements in his face and say, "Don't you worry about the nursery, I've got it covered." Yet I never followed through. I sensed that the moment I revealed the extent of my wealth, the nature of our relationship would change. It's like a switch flips when someone learns you hold that kind of power. But I'm curious. Comment 1 if you think secrets help protect relationships, or 2 if you believe secrets only cause more damage in the long run. The tension always rose to a simmer around the holidays. Thanksgiving used to be a pleasant gathering in our simpler days. My daughter, let's call her Andrea, was always calmer, more grounded. She married a considerate man, Paul, who shared her gentle spirit. Garrett, on the other hand, married a woman just as status conscious as he was. Victoria had style. No one could deny that. But she also harbored a certain impatience for anything that wasn't up to standard. Their house grew grander each year. New landscaping, new countertops, a new SUV in the driveway. Yet ironically, the more lavish their lifestyle, the more critical Garrett seemed about me. He'd say, "Mom, are you sure you can afford that dentist bill?" Or, "Mom, you don't mind if we host Thanksgiving this year, do you? We have more space, and you won't have to worry about all the shopping and cooking. It's better for you." I could see in his eyes the assumption that I was feeble, financially strapped, or simply incompetent. It was as though my own grown son was patting me on the head like I was a child. That fateful Thanksgiving started like any other. I arrived with a small pumpkin pie and a bottle of wine, a pleasant vintage, but not top shelf. Garrett barely acknowledged it. His focus was on his business partner and his partner's wife, who were also invited, presumably to admire the new renovations. We settled around the vast dining table, a picture-perfect display that could have been featured in a magazine. I was seated in a spot clearly chosen so I'd be out of the spotlight. It was all going relatively smoothly until dessert. My grandson asked for a new laptop for Christmas. Garrett responded that budgets were tight after so many expenses, and I, perhaps naively, offered to help. That sparked an immediate reaction. Garrett all but slammed his fork down. "We don't need your help, Mom," he snapped. "You need to worry about your own bills." That was when the tension boiled over, and in seconds, I was labeled a burden. If you've ever been on the receiving end of a harsh comment like that, you know how the words can echo. Let me know. Have you ever had a relative call you something so painful it stayed with you for weeks or months? Yes or no? I stood up, that single word, burden, ringing like a sour note in a high-ceilinged concert hall. For a fleeting second, I thought of blurting out the truth, that I had more money in liquid assets alone than all his West Hills neighbors combined, that my modest ranch house was worth a pittance compared to my other properties. But that would have been a reaction born of anger, a way to shame him in front of his family and friends. It wouldn't have mended our relationship, only deepened the fracture. So I swallowed my outrage, quietly thanked Victoria for hosting, and left. The November wind hit my cheeks as I stepped outside, and tears stung my eyes. My granddaughter Sophie ran after me, hugging my waist. "Grandma, don't go," she pleaded. "Dad didn't mean it." But from the look on Garrett's face, grim, unyielding, he certainly had. He was too wrapped up in the illusions he held about me. If I stayed, the argument would only get worse, especially with the grandchildren watching. I drove off into the dark, the city lights of Portland flickering as though the entire world had suddenly turned uncertain. At a stoplight, I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness. How had my son's perception of me become so skewed? Was it my fault for not being open? Or was it his fault for assuming the worst? When I got home, I sat in my living room, the quiet of the house intensifying my thoughts. On my coffee table lay the folder containing the bank statements, 8 figures to be exact, the result of decades of wise investments, real estate acquisitions, and a patent that had never ceased to pay dividends. I was so torn. If I revealed the truth now, would it simply warp our relationship further? Or had Thanksgiving proven it was already warped beyond what I could silently tolerate? That night, as I stared at the blinking cursor on my laptop, I considered telling the grandchildren the truth in a letter, but that felt vindictive, like a stealth bomb I'd drop into the heart of the family. Instead, I closed my laptop and sighed, wondering if any solution could salvage our broken trust. I needed guidance, so I picked up the phone and called George Mitchell, my longtime financial advisor. He was also one of my late husband's closest friends. If anyone could offer an objective perspective on family and finances, it was George. The next day, we sat in his office, the downtown view of Portland shimmering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Even in his 60s, George carried himself with the calm demeanor of someone used to managing high-stakes investments and high-emotion clients. After I recounted the Thanksgiving debacle, George pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and exhaled. "Eleanor," he said, referring to me by my middle name because he'd known me forever. "You've been playing a high-risk game of secrecy. When people don't know the truth, they fill in the blanks with their own assumptions. And sometimes, those assumptions are less charitable than reality." I admitted I'd hoped the children would simply see I was fine and let it go. Maybe I've been too naive, I concluded, my voice trembling. I worried that if they knew, they'd treat me differently. George leaned forward, resting his elbows on his polished desk. They probably would, but it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, especially if you set expectations clearly. Right now, your son is operating under a complete falsehood. He's convinced you're a financial black hole, poised to drain him dry. You're seeing the consequences of that fear. It struck me that I'd spent so many years trying to protect Garrett and Andrea from the complications of money, inheritance fights, enabling laziness, or spawning entitlement that I'd neglected to show them who I really was. George, with a hint of compassion in his tone, said, "You're well within your rights to keep your finances private, but clearly it's hurting you and your family now." We brainstormed. Maybe I'd start by selling my ranch house. I could move to a more modern condo, something that reflected my true financial freedom, and then, at a family gathering, outline the truth once and for all. It felt terrifying, but I was also tired of being pegged as a burden, especially when I was anything but. If you've been following this story so far, let me know with 3 if you've ever had to deliver shocking news to family, or 4 if you fortunately never had to. After leaving George's office, I drove aimlessly for a bit, passing the neighborhoods Garrett used to admire, the ones filled with sleek modern homes and perfectly curated lawns. I remembered him as a boy, wide-eyed and ambitious, saying, "One day, I'll have a house so big you'll need a map to find your bedroom." He'd laughed with innocent joy back then. How did that dream become twisted into arrogance and contempt? During the drive, I made a snap decision. Rather than go home, I pointed my car toward the Oregon coast, heading for a place only a handful of people in my life knew existed: my beachfront cottage at Cannon Beach. My husband and I had purchased it quietly years after the patent took off, an escape from city life, a sanctuary. The kids never knew because we kept it for ourselves, a retreat to nurture our marriage and store up memories. Even after he died, I couldn't bear to disclose it. It felt like our private paradise. The November skies were draped in clouds, and a slight drizzle splattered the windshield as I pulled into the narrow gravel driveway. The cottage looked as welcoming as ever, with a cedar-shingled exterior that had weathered storms yet stood firm. Inside, I could still sense my husband's presence, his laugh lingering in the corners where we used to sit and watch the tides roll in. That weekend, I let the ocean's roar fill the silence that otherwise would have been occupied by my thoughts of Thanksgiving. The cottage was my safe haven, a place of raw honesty where I could no longer avoid the truth. If I kept my wealth hidden, Garrett's resentment would only grow. If I revealed it, the relationship might change in unpredictable ways. Still, the memory of him sneering, "You're just a burden, Mom," weighed heavily. Eventually, I returned to the city, more resolute. I'd list my ranch house for sale, purchase a modern condo in the Pearl District, and call a gathering where everyone, Garrett, Andrea, their spouses, even the grandchildren, would see a version of me that matched the reality of my bank account. But before I go on, I'd love to hear your perspective. Do you think it's better to protect loved ones from the truth, or does honesty, no matter how scary, always win out? Let me know with a quick comment. The process of selling my home went faster than I expected. The real estate market was hot, and within a week, I had multiple offers well above my asking price. The day the final paperwork was signed, I felt a pang of nostalgia. This was the house where both Garrett and Andrea took their first steps, where we'd celebrated birthdays, and where I'd spent so many lonely evenings after my husband passed. Yet it also symbolized the illusions I'd allowed to persist. I found a condo in the Pearl District that was sleek, open, and boasted a balcony overlooking the city lights. It was triple the cost of my old house, but I could afford it 10 times over, so I paid in cash. No mortgage, no fuss. Just a swift transaction that left the realtors gaping, especially since they thought I was some retired teacher with limited funds. In a flash, I realized how liberating it felt to exist in a space that actually matched my financial reality. No more squeaking by with outdated furniture or a battered old car. I traded my car in, too, for a brand new hybrid sedan. The salesman nearly fell over himself trying to explain financing options until I politely said, "I'll pay up front." News of my move spread among family quickly. Andrea was cautiously supportive, saying, "I'm proud you're doing something for yourself, Mom." Garrett, however, texted me endless questions, each more accusatory than the last. "How can you afford a condo in the Pearl? Are you sure you're thinking this through, Mom?" He ended one message with, "This is so unlike you." And in that moment, I realized how little he knew me at all. The day after I fully settled in, I invited both families over for a dinner. I specified that it was important, no excuses. Andrea agreed immediately. Garrett hemmed and hawed before eventually capitulating. When the evening arrived, I dressed in a sophisticated navy blouse and black slacks, put on my late husband's favorite pearl necklace, and waited. I set out hors d'oeuvres on my granite countertops, glancing occasionally at the neat stack of financial statements and trust documents that George had prepared. Quick check-in. If you were in my shoes, would you be excited to finally reveal the truth or terrified of the possible fallout? Comment your thoughts. Sometimes even the bravest among us struggle with fear. Andrea and her husband arrived first, their eyes widening as they took in my spacious new living area. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed off the city skyline, while carefully chosen artwork, pieces I'd secretly collected over the years, adorned the walls. My daughter set down the casserole she'd brought and turned to me with genuine warmth. "Mom, this place is amazing. It's so you. Why didn't you do this sooner?" I shrugged, a bit self-conscious. "I was trying to keep up a certain image," I admitted softly, "but I'm done with that." Shortly after, Garrett and Victoria showed up with their children, Zach and Sophie, in tow. Sophie beamed at the view. "Grandma, we're so high up," she exclaimed, pressing her nose to the glass. Zach gave a low whistle, muttering, "Whoa, fancy," under his breath. Garrett and Victoria exchanged perplexed glances. I could practically see the gears turning in my son's head. Where did this money come from? I ushered them inside, offering them seats around the sleek dining table where fresh flowers formed a vibrant centerpiece. My own reflection glinted off the polished surface. I glanced at George, who was standing discreetly off to the side, holding a folder of documents. For a moment, my stomach fluttered with nerves. This was the confrontation I'd both dreaded and yearned for. Before dinner was served, I took a breath and said, "There's something I need to share. It's about who I really am, financially and otherwise." I watched Garrett's eyes flick toward George's folder, suspicion lighting his gaze. Andrea rested a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Go ahead, Mom. We're listening." I motioned for George to step forward. He cleared his throat, explaining in his calm, measured tone that he had been my financial advisor for years, entrusted with managing significant assets. When he mentioned the phrases substantial holdings, diversified portfolio, and eight-figure net worth, the silence in the room was like a vacuum. Garrett's expression crumbled momentarily. Victoria looked as though she were struggling to keep her composure. "Now, if you're watching or reading, I'd love to hear from you. Is this the kind of moment where you'd say, 'Finally, the truth'? Or would you cringe for everyone in the room? Drop a quick truth or cringe below." There it was, the bombshell. I laid out the details gently but decisively. I told them how their father and I started with almost nothing, how we slowly accumulated money from a patent that never stopped paying, and how those returns allowed us to invest in real estate, stocks, and eventually even a few board positions that quietly netted me hundreds of thousands a year. I didn't talk about it, I explained, because wealth can complicate relationships and overshadow love. I wanted you to develop your own work ethic. And then I turned to Garrett, recalling the tension at Thanksgiving. "You accused me of being a burden," I said, my voice trembling only slightly. "I want you to know just how off base that assumption has been. Not only am I not a burden, I could have paid for your house in cash and still had money left over." Garrett's cheeks went red, his jaw working wordlessly. He looked like he wanted to protest, but the facts were staring him in the face. Victoria grabbed his arm, possibly worried he'd say something rash. Andrea, by contrast, leaned back, tears shimmering in her eyes, not of anger, but relief. "I always suspected there was more to your story than you let on," she whispered. The grandchildren, Zach and Sophie, just seemed confused. They were old enough to grasp some of what was happening, but not old enough to fully comprehend the depth of emotions swirling around. Eventually, Sophie piped up. "So, you're rich, Grandma?" Her innocent wonder broke the tension. I chuckled softly, tears spilling over. "Yes, sweetheart, I guess I am." The evening stretched on, with Garrett's initial shock turning to anger, then grudging acceptance, and finally a fatigued apology. Though it was rough-edged, I braced myself for the aftermath. Nothing about this was going to be instantly resolved. If you've ever had a moment where everything you believed was flipped upside down, you know how disorienting it can be. Feel free to chime in with 5 if you've been in a major life pivot, or 6 if life has been relatively smooth sailing for you. The discussion that night was long and winding, with Garrett asking pointed questions. Why drive that old car if you could afford anything? Why live in that outdated house all these years? He sounded almost betrayed, as though I'd orchestrated a grand ruse just to trick him. In a way, I understood. For the better part of 4 decades, I had concealed a life-altering truth. But I also reminded him, and everyone else, that I'd tried repeatedly to say I was fine. No one believed me. They saw frugality and assumed poverty. They saw my sensible choices and assumed I was incapable of enjoying life. Andrea was more accepting, saying gently, "You're the same mother who read me bedtime stories and patched up my scraped knees. Whether you have $10 or 10 million doesn't change that." Paul, her husband, nodded in agreement, though I noticed the occasional flicker of curiosity in his eyes. He was probably doing the mental math of what exactly an 8-figure net worth could buy. Garrett remained tense. "It's a lot to process, Mom," he admitted, "and I can't pretend I'm not a little embarrassed about what I said at Thanksgiving." An understatement, but one I was willing to let slide for now. The real question was how we moved forward. Could we rebuild trust, or was the damage too deep? Sensing the weight in the room, George quietly excused himself. I walked him to the door, where he whispered, "Good luck, Eleanor. I know this isn't easy, but it's necessary. Let me know if you need anything else." When I returned, the family conversation had shifted to the practicalities of whether I'd remain in the condo, what my estate planning involved, and whether I intended to gift money outright or keep it in a trust. Just as I was about to explain the structure of trusts George and I had set up, Sophie tugged on my sleeve. "Grandma," she said in a hushed tone, "please don't be mad at Dad. He's just worried." My heart clenched. Even at her young age, she sensed that her father's anger stemmed from worry, pride, or both. Before we continue, I want to keep you all engaged in this story. Please comment 1 if you still have faith in Garrett's ability to change, or 2 if you're convinced he won't. It's fascinating to see how people interpret these family dynamics. In the days following that initial reveal, Garrett's emotions seemed to ping-pong between resentment and reluctant acceptance. On one hand, he realized he no longer needed to stress over my potential medical bills or living expenses. On the other, his sense of pride was bruised. He had built so much of his identity on being the provider for his aging mother, helping poor old Mom out whenever she needed it. Now the rug had been yanked from under him. Andrea, ever the peacekeeper, reminded him gently that it wasn't all about him, that my decisions might have had less to do with him and more to do with my own past and the complexities of wealth. A week after the dinner, we spoke on the phone. It was less confrontational than I feared. He admitted that his anger at Thanksgiving stemmed partly from financial pressures he'd been facing, a mortgage bigger than he could comfortably handle. private school tuition for his kids, and renovations that had ballooned over budget. He'd taken for granted that, eventually, I might have to move in with them, and secretly, that scenario filled him with dread. "So you resented me," I said, carefully weighing each word, "because you thought I'd become dependent on you." His sigh crackled through the line. "Yes," he said simply, "and that made me feel guilty, so I lashed out. I was wrong, but I'm still upset about the secrecy, Mom. It's like you didn't trust me enough to tell me." I swallowed, a pang of regret hitting me. I did trust you. Maybe not with the money, but with everything else. Your father and I agreed we wanted you kids to forge your own paths, not rely on a fortune. And the longer we waited, the bigger the secret became. We both fell silent. "So, where do we go from here?" he finally asked. I never thought I'd hear those words from my own son. "You're just a burden, Mom." The Thanksgiving table fell silent, forks frozen mid-air, faces paralyzed in shock. My grandchildren's eyes widened, darting between their father and me, but Garrett didn't flinch, didn't lower his voice, didn't show a hint of regret as he continued. "We're always having to check on you, drive you places, worry about your bills. When are you going to start thinking about how this affects us? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." 40 years I'd spent building a life, sacrificing everything for my children. 40 years of careful planning, silent victories, and a secret that would have changed everything had he known. As tears threatened to fall, I simply placed my napkin beside my half-eaten turkey, thanked Victoria for the lovely meal, and walked out into the cold November air. What my son didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in my modest handbag rested bank statements totaling 8 figures. The burden they resented so much was sitting on a fortune that could have changed their lives in an instant. But I didn't say a word. Sometimes silence speaks louder than money ever could. After that phone conversation, we agreed to meet for coffee, just the two of us. The bustling cafe in downtown Portland was neutral territory. The hiss of the espresso machine and the hum of patrons provided background noise that softened any tension. Over cappuccinos, we tentatively broached the next steps. Garrett admitted that he'd looked into ways to challenge my estate plan. "I'm sorry," he said, glancing at the foam swirling in his cup. "I thought if you were being taken advantage of by an advisor, or maybe if you weren't thinking clearly, I could step in. But now I see that was just me trying to control the narrative. I'll stop, I swear." It was a sobering moment. The idea that he'd considered legal maneuvers to override my wishes was painful, but I also recognized it as a manifestation of his fear that everything he'd known was a lie, fear that I wouldn't include him in decisions, fear that maybe he'd end up overshadowed by Andrea or left out entirely. I took a deep breath, remembering the vow I'd made to myself at the beach cottage. No more illusions. "I'm not going to punish you for having those thoughts," I said evenly. "But understand, if you try to undercut my autonomy, I'll respond accordingly. I love you too much to let you walk all over me." He stiffened at first, but then nodded. "I get it," he murmured. "I can't believe how much I've messed up." Yet over the next hour, we formed a sort of truce. He'd respect my decisions about how to handle my money, and I'd be as transparent as possible about major changes, like if I were to buy another property or set up new trust funds for the grandchildren. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. By the way, I'd like to hear from you reading this. 1. If you believe in second chances. 2. If you think once trust is broken, it's nearly impossible to regain. Sometimes family relationships are a constant dance of breaking and rebuilding trust, and each of us handles it differently. In the weeks that followed, I settled more comfortably into my Pearl District condo. Andrea and Paul visited often, sometimes bringing groceries or little gifts to decorate my new space. They said it felt good to see me living more freely, without the weight of secrecy. My granddaughter Sophie, who was blossoming into a talented artist, marveled at the modern design and the sweeping views. "Grandma, you're like an artist in a high-rise studio," she exclaimed. Garrett's visits were initially infrequent, weighed down by tension, but bit by bit, he started coming by on weekends. He'd step onto my balcony, linger over a cup of coffee, and strike up a conversation about the stock market or local politics, topics he'd typically avoided discussing with me before. It was as if he was suddenly curious about my opinions, realizing I might have insights he'd previously dismissed. Meanwhile, the hidden beach cottage was no longer hidden. I invited them all to join me there for a weekend in early spring. Garrett's reaction was tentative, part curiosity, part unease. "Why didn't we know about this place for so long?" he asked, in a voice that bordered on accusatory. I gave him the same honest answer I'd been giving since the reveal. "It was something I shared with your father. Our haven. I wasn't ready to let others into that space." Under the dim glow of the cottage's living room lamp, I pulled out old photographs of my husband and me in our younger years, holding fishing rods on the shoreline, laughing over a bonfire, watching the kids building sandcastles in a smaller rented cabin before we bought our own. "This place has always been about love," I explained gently, "not about money. That's why it was so private for so long." There, on that weathered couch, near the sound of crashing waves, our family found a moment of solidarity. We toasted marshmallows in the fireplace, played board games, and told stories. Garrett even cracked a real smile when Sophie beat him at a particularly complicated puzzle game. It was, in many ways, the closest we'd felt in years. Pause for engagement. Where are you guys tuning in from? Type city if you want to share it, or country if you're international. I appreciate knowing how far stories can reach. Back to the story. Even with these moments of connection, I remained cautious. I'd learned the hard way that trust isn't rebuilt overnight. Garrett, to his credit, began to open up about his own financial struggles. The large mortgage in an upscale neighborhood, the private school fees that seemed to climb each year, the car payments and credit card balances he barely kept ahead of. "I was so scared you'd need help," he confessed one evening, "because I wasn't sure how I'd give it." His vulnerability took me by surprise. I'd never seen him so honest about his own limitations. His entire persona had been built around confidence and competence. Suddenly, I realized the fear that drove him: fear of failing his family, fear of failing me, fear of not living up to the image he'd cultivated. It reminded me of a time when Garrett was 8 and fell off his bike, scraping his knee badly. He'd limped home, tears in his eyes, but absolutely refused to let me see the wound. When I finally coaxed him into letting me wash and bandage it, I saw how deep it was. He'd tried to pretend everything was fine, but he'd bled through his jeans. That was Garrett in a nutshell, wanting to appear invulnerable, even when in pain. In a way, my secret fortune had inadvertently kept him in the dark about what real financial security looked like. He'd grown up believing everything he had was earned from his own grit, that I was frugal because I had no choice, and that the slightest shift could force us all into hardship. Now, the foundation of that story was gone. Even so, it was up to him to confront the illusions he'd built, just as it was up to me to open doors instead of locking them. If you're reading and this is resonating in any way, drop a quick comment. Sometimes the heaviest weight in family relationships is the unspoken fear that no one else can see our wounds. But once we show them, healing becomes possible. Eventually, Garrett began asking me for financial advice, not in the condescending way he used to, but with genuine curiosity. "How do you determine which stocks are worth investing in long term?" he'd inquire. Or, "How did you know to buy real estate in that up-and-coming neighborhood?" It was as though he was realizing for the first time that I'd been quietly successful at a game he'd always claimed to excel in. We formed a fragile, tentative partnership. I'd show him spreadsheets, historical data, my logic for risk assessment. He'd share what he'd learned in marketing and networking. Gradually, we moved from stilted mother son interactions into something resembling respect. Andrea, delighted by the shift, jokingly called us the Wilson Financial Duo. At one point, I felt confident enough to share an even deeper secret. I'd been donating anonymously to certain charities for years, including a scholarship fund at a local community college. I'd covered the tuition for multiple students, never signing my name because I hadn't wanted the attention. Garrett's face softened when I told him. "You changed lives without needing any accolades," he said, almost in awe. "I wish I'd known about this sooner." I shrugged, half smiling. It was enough to know I'd helped someone. Money to me is a resource for doing good. It's why your father and I never splurged on a lavish lifestyle. We found joy in simpler things. By the time spring rolled around, the condo felt like home, and my relationships with both children had settled into a calmer rhythm. But there was one more test lying ahead: how Garrett would handle the final reading of my updated estate plan. George had prepared documents that clearly laid out the conditions. If either Garrett or Andrea showed patterns of financial irresponsibility or attempts to undermine the philanthropic aspects of my estate, they'd forfeit a portion. It was harsh, but also, in my mind, fair. Now, do you guys think this kind of structured estate plan is wise, or do you feel it's controlling? Wise or controlling? I respect both viewpoints. Wealth, after all, can be a complicated inheritance. We convened in George's office: Garrett, Andrea, me, and the carefully typed documents that could change our family's future. Even the hum of the air conditioner felt loud in that room. A mild tension underpinned the meeting. We all knew any pushback from Garrett might reignite old grievances. Yet, to my surprise, he listened intently. George explained that my estate would be divided equally between my two children, but significant parts were placed into trusts for the grandchildren's education, as well as various philanthropic endeavors. The conditions were explicitly outlined. Those who acted in ways that contradicted core values, like honesty, integrity, and charitable giving, could see their inheritance adjusted. It wasn't about punishing them if they disagreed with how I spent my money in life, but about ensuring that my life's work continued to support the principles I cherished after I was gone. Andrea seemed fully at peace with it. She offered a small smile. "I know you, Mom," she said. "This is exactly in line with who you've always been." Garrett, however, fidgeted. "So, if I become reckless, or if I try to funnel all the funds into my own business, I lose out?" he asked, bitterness tinging his voice. George nodded calmly. "Exactly. Your mother has structured the will and trusts in such a way that her philanthropic goals remain non-negotiable." I braced for an argument, but after a moment of obvious internal struggle, Garrett exhaled slowly. "All right," he murmured. "I respect it. It's your money, Mom, and your wishes should be honored." I felt a rush of relief that I could barely contain. Maybe my son was finally seeing me as a person, not just a means to an end or a fragile figure to manage. We concluded the meeting without conflict. On the way out, Garrett even cracked a wry smile. "Guess I better keep my nose clean," he joked, and for once, it didn't feel like an attack. It felt like acceptance. Where are you all watching from now? Drop a quick note about your time zone or region. Sometimes it's fun to see how stories about family resonate across continents. A few weeks later, Garrett did something that truly surprised me. He scaled back his corporate ambitions to volunteer at a local youth mentorship program. "I'm not quitting my job," he clarified when he told me about it. "But I realized I've been chasing titles and salaries for so long that I forgot why I got into business in the first place. I actually enjoy helping younger people figure out their paths. At first, I worried it might be a short lived whim, a reaction to guilt, or the prospect of my conditions. But as time went on, he seemed genuinely passionate. He'd come by on a Friday afternoon, telling me about a high schooler who wanted to start a small apparel line, or a teen who dreamed of launching a tech startup. For the first time in years, I heard a certain lightness in his voice, an enthusiasm not driven by dollar signs, but by purpose. Meanwhile, Andrea continued thriving in her own career, occasionally calling me to share successes or vent about challenges. She also offered ideas for philanthropic expansions I could undertake. Mom, have you ever considered funding an art program for underprivileged kids? Sophie's school is always looking for sponsors. That seed of an idea grew, and I made inquiries about establishing a new art scholarship. I realized I didn't have to be hidden or anonymous anymore. I could step forward, forging meaningful impacts under my own name. Summer rolled around, and I invited the whole family to spend a weekend at Cannon Beach again. This time, Garrett arrived looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. He even joked that he wanted to upgrade his surf lessons from the local shop. As we gathered around a beach bonfire that night, listening to the crackling flames and the whoosh of distant waves, he leaned over and said quietly, "I'm sorry for everything. I hope you can forgive me." It's a powerful moment when someone earnestly apologizes. If you've ever gone through that, let me know with a yes or nope, never happened to me. Some apologies can transform a lifetime of resentment into something closer to healing. Forgiveness isn't a simple switch you flip. It's more like a bridge you decide to walk across, piece by piece, trusting that the supports will hold. Hearing Garrett say those words at the beach bonfire triggered a cascade of memories. The Thanksgiving fiasco, the hush in the dining room, the scorn in his voice, and that single word, burden, that stung so powerfully. I also remembered the nights I'd worried he would hate me if he discovered the truth, or the nights I resented him for not bothering to ask how I was really doing. Yet, I saw something different in him now. A man stepping away from the illusions he'd clung to. A man trying, really trying to be better for himself and for his family. I looked at him, the firelight dancing across his face, and said, "I'm not going to pretend the past didn't hurt, but I appreciate that you're making real changes." "I do forgive you, Garrett." He nodded, eyes suspiciously bright. Then he turned to watch the flames, letting the moment linger without further words. Sometimes, in families, silence can be healing when accompanied by mutual understanding. That weekend became a turning point. We walked along the shoreline together the next morning, discussing everything from how to manage college funds for Sophie and Zach to how I might extend my philanthropic endeavors beyond scholarships. Garrett listened thoughtfully to my ideas about financial literacy programs in underserved communities. Instead of rolling his eyes or questioning my capabilities, he said, "That's brilliant. Let me know how I can help." In turn, I asked about the challenges he faced in scaling his volunteer program. He confessed it was tough balancing corporate demands and community involvement. Still, he was determined to find a way. The conversation felt natural, a flow of respect that we'd never had before. Let's do a quick reflection. If you're finding meaning in this family journey, drop an emoji, maybe a heart or a thoughtful face, to let me know. Sometimes sharing stories is how we learn we're not alone in these struggles and triumphs. By the time autumn leaves began to turn, we had established a new family tradition. Monthly dinners rotating between Andrea's home, Garrett's, yes, still lavish, but feeling more welcoming now, and my condo. Occasionally, we even included a weekend at the beach cottage, if everyone's schedule allowed. These gatherings were no longer the stiff, showy affairs they once were. Instead, they were genuine, filled with real conversations and laughter that felt earned, not forced. Andrea's children were flourishing, with Sophie immersing herself in painting and Zach excelling at science projects. Garrett even asked me to speak at one of his mentorship group sessions on financial planning. He introduced me not just as his mom, but as the smartest investor I know. I nearly teared up at the public acknowledgement of my abilities. In private moments, Garrett and I still navigated bumps in the road. Sometimes old habits die hard. He'd occasionally slip back into that patronizing tone if he suspected I might need help with something as trivial as hooking up my new television. But each time, either he'd catch himself or I'd gently call him out on it. The difference now was that he listened, he tried, and he apologized without turning defensive. The hidden fortune was hidden no longer, yet it felt less central to our relationship. It wasn't about the bank statements or the trust funds anymore. It was about the honesty and respect that replaced the old illusions. I could finally shop without guilt, donate to causes close to my heart openly, and provide for my grandchildren in ways that aligned with my values. The tension had melted into an understanding that I was neither a fragile old woman nor a sugar mama throwing cash around. I was simply me, a mother with both resources and the autonomy to use them. Sometimes I still remember those heartbreaking words, "You're just a burden," and feel a pang, but I also look at how far we've come since that Thanksgiving. In a strange twist of fate, that painful moment pushed us all toward a deeper connection and a more truthful bond. If you stuck with me until now, I'd love for you to comment, "Still here." It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? One crisp November day, almost a year to the date of that infamous Thanksgiving, I found myself setting the table at my condo for a holiday feast. This time, I was the host by choice, and the decor and menu were entirely my own, simple but intentional. No one forced the location on me because I was unable to handle it. I wasn't too poor to cater the meal, nor too frail to prepare the turkey. Instead, we compromised. I would cook the main course because I genuinely enjoyed it, and Andrea and Victoria would bring side dishes and desserts. Garrett, fulfilling a promise to share more in the workload, had spent the morning helping me set up folding chairs and rearrange furniture to accommodate guests. The doorbell rang, and in came the rest of the family, arms laden with dishes, greeting me with genuine warmth. The grandchildren hurried in, setting their jackets on the sofa before rushing to see my new painting in progress, a project that reminded me of the ocean's horizon. Garrett followed, placing a bottle of wine on the counter, a far cry from the half-acknowledged offerings of the past. As we settled around my dining table, large enough to fit us all comfortably, Garrett raised his glass. "I want to acknowledge something," he began, a touch of nervousness in his eyes. "This time last year, I said words I'll always regret, but a lot has changed since then. Mom, you've taught me that wealth isn't about possession, it's about potential. I used to see you as a burden because I was too blinded by my own worries to see who you really were. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for giving me the chance to learn." A hush fell. I felt Andrea's hand slip into mine. The grandchildren watched, wide-eyed and innocent. Paul and Victoria exchanged glances, both of them softly smiling. My heart, once bruised by that burden comment, found a moment of wholeness. I clinked my glass against Garrett's. "To learning and to growth," I offered quietly. Our family, though flawed, had taken steps toward something healthier and more honest. So there you have it, the story of how my son called me just a burden at Thanksgiving, only to realize that the mother he underestimated all those years carried a secret fortune. But more important than the money itself was the journey to rebuild trust, respect, and love in a family torn by assumptions and hidden truths. It wasn't easy, it wasn't quick, but it was possible. If you find yourself in a similar situation, maybe you have secrets you're scared to share, or you've had a falling out over financial misunderstandings. Know that healing can happen if people are willing to step into vulnerability. Wealth, or the lack of it, doesn't have to define who we are to one another. What truly matters is whether we're honest about our needs, our fears, and our hopes. And this is where I'd love your final feedback. Comment 1 if you're someone who believes honesty would have solved the tension sooner. Comment 2 if you think the secrecy might have been necessary until Garrett was ready to grow. And that, my dear listeners, brings us to the end of our tale. The power of truth, forgiveness, and self discovery can indeed transform lives in unexpected ways. Have you ever faced a similar family challenge or kept a secret that changed everything once revealed? Please share your stories and opinions in the comments. I always look forward to hearing from you. And don't forget to subscribe to her Fireside Stories channel. Your support means the world and helps us bring more heartwarming and thought-provoking tales your way. Until next time, stay warm by the fireside and keep those stories burning bright.